I want to say a few words about the differences between Mishna Berura and Aruch Hashulchan. This is, of course, a huge topic, and there is a lot of discussion all over the place about it. But I think that when people ask, who do we follow more? What if there is a dispute between Aruch Hashulchan and Mishna Berura? Which great posek should we follow? There is a great misunderstanding about even posing such a question. And let me first start with the major difference, of course, besides the style. Aruch Hashulchan is usually written in discussing much more the sources. He usually starts with the Talmud and often brings Rambam and only then brings the conclusion in Halacha. But most importantly, Aruch Hashulchan is much more relying on himself. He quotes much fewer authorities, much fewer. Sometimes certain great authorities that Mishna Berura quotes almost on every page, like Chai Adam, Eliyahu Rabbah, many other authorities, are almost not found in Aruch Hashulchan at all. He only quotes primarily a few major commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch out of Achronim. So his main work was basically based on his own decisions. And this is not so atypical for a Lithuanian Gadol. A lot of them, in fact, mostly relied on themselves and wrote what they thought. But Mishna Berura, his style is actually closer to the way the Hungarians and actually the Sefarim also, they usually try to find a lot of sources and bring the major accepted authorities and then decide between them. And this is the main job of the Mishna Berura. If you look at the number of sources he brings, it was huge for his time, considering that he was also not rich and he didn't have access to a lot of books. And he, for instance, doesn't bring that many Shailot with Shuvot, responsa. But in terms of the major commentators of the Shulchan Aruch, just like he writes an introduction, his main job was to bring all the major commentators, not really up to his generation. The Gdolim that were in his generation, or even one generation before, are not mentioned that often in his books. But his main work was to bring the Gdolim that existed 2 or 3 generations before him and earlier. And that's the huge job he did. And generally speaking, the Hungarian Gdolim like this approach much more than Aruch Hashulchan. In fact, in a lot of the writings of Hungarian Gdolim, you could see Hasagot on Aruch Hashulchan, and they say that the fact that he often argues with many authorities because he thought that way is not really acceptable. And that's just one method of paskening halacha. On the other hand, among Litvish Gdolim, some of them liked specifically Aruch Hashulchan, and they also consider him in a sense Acharon compared to Mishna Berura because he quotes Mishna Berura in a few places. Although apparently he didn't see all the volumes. They lived approximately in the same time period, and the Mishna Berura, of course, wasn't coming out all at once. But whatever the case may be, the fact that the Litvish Gdolim often say that halacha should follow Aruch Hashulchan, and also because he was a Rav specifically of his town. It's the same town where the famous Musar yeshiva existed, Novardok, but he was not really related, at least not fully related to that yeshiva. He was just a Rav of the town. But at any rate, it gives him more of an authority of practical halacha. Of course, Aruch Hashulchan includes much larger range of topics. He started with writing on Choshen Mishpat, not with Orach Chaim. He didn't write things in order. Not everything was preserved. We don't have parts of Yoradea and parts of Even HaEzer. At any rate, one of the questions of who to follow, actually, I think, is not really relevant to even ask, because there are cases when we don't follow either of them. Here is a simple example. Both Aruch Hashulchan and Mishna Berura think that when you make the bracha Shechiyanu v'Kiyimanu v'Gianu, you say Lizman Hazeh. They write that in Hilchot Chanukah. And of course it applies all over the place. And even on Chanukah itself, it also would then mean that the other bracha you say Bizman Hazeh. B'yamim ha'em Bizman Hazeh. Not with a definite article. Right? Lazman Hazeh means as if it's leha, right? As if it's a definite article. Lizman Hazeh means without that definite article. So that's a big dispute. And a lot of the Achronim write, based on the writings of Magen Avraham, Kaf HaChaim, for instance, also, that Lizman Hazeh is the correct nusach. But almost none of the Sidurim bring it, so we don't really follow it. Chabad follows it. Chabad usually follows the Rebbe, and the Rebbe who also held Lizman Hazeh and Bizman Hazeh. So in fact, that's in his Sidur, and that's what Chabad says. But Kimiat, everybody else Hasidim and Litaim and Sephardim all say lazman hazeh with a definite article. Right? That's grammatically seems to be more accepted. Although I saw recently in a Siddur Hagra, Ezor Eliyahu, he claims that in fact there are exclusions to this principle. You don't have to have definite articles in both words, right? Just because it's hazeh doesn't mean it has to be lazman, and therefore he actually prints back lizman hazeh. I don't know how many people follow this. We don't know if the Gra actually followed this. I'd say the Siddur is trying to reconstruct what the Nusach HaGra was, but we don't always know. At any rate, the minhag is definitely to say lazman hazeh, and a lot of the latest achronim and the sages of our generation supported this based on the general grammatical principles. This might sound like a minor issue, but there are other more major issues where people just don't follow the Mishna Berura, including even Litvisher people. I could bring tens of examples of this, but I'm not going to right now because this is not the topic. So my point is that when we say that there is a dispute between Aruch Hashulchan and Mishna Berura, it's usually not a dispute in a vacuum. It's almost always a dispute of a number of authorities on each side. And there is often a minhag specifically. There is usually what the Talmud calls sugya de alma. Usually there is an accepted way of doing things. And therefore, I would say that it's not really very common that we would say, oh, okay, because it's a dispute of Aruch Hashulchan and Mishna Berura, let's decide who do we follow in such cases when there's such a dispute. Because practically speaking, in almost every case, there is much more than that involved. And certainly if a person wants to follow Mishna Berura in everything, he's totally allowed to. As opposed to, let's say, deciding to follow Magen Avram in everything. Imagine a person decides to follow Magen Avram in everything. That would mean, for example, that he would start Shabbat after Shkia, right? According to Magen Avram, as most authorities in his time, the Ben Hashmashot starts not with the regular sundown, but much later. So according to Magen Avram, even 20 or 30 minutes after sundown, you could still light the Shabbos candles. Obviously, nobody's allowed to do that today. We definitely accepted on ourselves the shita that the regular sundown that we see is when Shabbat starts, and for all other practical purposes, it's considered Ben Hashmashot. So we're not allowed to just choose some authority and say, I'll follow, let me follow Rashba in everything. Let me follow Taz, Turi Zahav in everything. No, we cannot do that. But Mishna Berura is late enough and accepted enough that there may be some people who follow him in absolutely everything. I don't know, maybe. But the vast majority of Litvish and certainly non-Litvish Ashkenazic Jews do not follow Mishna Berura in absolutely everything. There are at least some cases when we follow the Sugya de Alma, right? And the minhag is to follow other authorities. And like I said, it could be that it's not because Aruch Hashulchan argues with him. And in terms of practical learning, today, of course, there are a number of specifically editions of Mishna Berura with more notes from other authorities. The two most famous ones, probably, the most common ones is the Dirshu edition. There is two versions of it. The later version has more. Unfortunately, the regular volumes do not have an index, so that makes it a lot harder to find what you need. They have a separate volume that has an index for all 6 volumes of Mishna Berura and the Dirshu. And then there is a Mishna Berura where they don't actually print the actual Mishna Berura, right? The Dirshu edition is printed the same way as ArtScroll prints the Talmud, and that is on one side there is the original, and on the other side is all the notes. As opposed to the other edition that I wanted to mention is Piskei Teshuvot. So that it's written by Hasidish Rav, and there he does not actually he doesn't print the entire Mishna Berura. He just writes various notes on Mishna Berura and sometimes on Shulchan Aruch itself or on the other commentators to it, for instance, Shari Tshuva. But most of the time it's on Mishna Berura and on Shari Tziyun and on Biur Halacha. It's all part of Mishna Berura. So those are the two probably most well used today editions. There are also other editions of Mishna Berura with all kinds of commentaries. There are even Sephardi editions with Mishna Berura where they write what the accepted Sephardi authorities think and paskin. Some have just small notes, right, tiny notes on the page with just a few minor or major issues, but with everything short. Others are in exactly the same format as Dirshu, that is, for a page of Mishna Berura, there are tons and tons of large notes discussing the psak of Rav Adi Yosef and Rav Benson Abba Shaul and other accepted Sephardi poskim. So I guess just by the fact of how many more new additions there are of Mishna Berura with various commentators and various other sources, that would probably point to the fact that the history already decided for us that Min Hashamayim it is that Mishna Berura is much more accepted than Aruch Hashulchan. In fact, I even have editions of Aruch Hashulchan with some notes on the bottom of Mishna Berura. There are similar editions of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch also. Meaning in the cases when there is an argument, they would put a note on the bottom, or the Mishnah Berura paskins differently. So it seems that the Mishnah Berura was the most accepted. Not every one of his psakim, as I said, is accepted by the majority of the Jewish people, or even the Ashkenazi Jews. And on this I'll end for today. If you like this video, please press like.